was at a conference at Northwestern, and Linda and I were walking across the bridge. She had read a paper of mine, which I'm going to critique when I give my talk, and she said to me, you know, you don't really understand gender negotiation. And we started to do a bunch of work on that. That was the place I got to start to think about it differently. So let me just start by read my talk. I want to start telling you first how truly honored and touched I am to receive this award. Over the years, many outstanding scholars have been honored for their contributions, but I am guessing I am unique in the role that Jeff Rubin played in my career. He not only helped guide me to make my research more practical, but also critically, he set me on a path that took my theoretical and practical work in the direction we're on here today. I just need to find, okay, good. I met Jeff when he came to MIT, the Sloan School, when I was a doctoral student. He was giving a presentation on his in-progress work on third-party roles, focusing on Henry Kissinger as a mediator in the Middle East. I really don't remember his presentation specifically. Let me just see if I get this. But I have what I wrote in the introduction to Negotiation Eclectics, which was a book that came from a conference Program Negotiation ran to honor Jeff's work. He described his model of mediation as seeing an elephant. He could describe all parts of it, the mediator's role in its totality, identifying the different roles mediators can play. Well, my first paper published on my dissertation was called Roles Mediators Play. And I thought my conception of roles, based on my ethnographic study of mediators, had everything to do with the relationships that the mediators had with the chief spokesman. So, put this up. There's my mediators. That was my dissertation. So I had some ideas about the roles mediators play and how they come about. And they were not aligned with Jeff's. For me, context was critical. And I remember being very vocal about it. And still do. And that my relationship with Jeff started with this rather heated disagreement. And I think he enjoyed it. And so when Jeff became executive director of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School and asked me to be the associate director, I think it was in part because he liked to fight with me. My association with PON shaped my career in several ways. Let me start with mediation and then move to gender. When I arrived at PON in the late 1980s, my first project was to expand the work on mediation, explicitly to translate theory into practice. I convened a group of well-known scholars in the field. They're pretty old, I don't know, most of them will be here. Ken Creswell, Sally Murray, Eileen Babbitt, John Forrester from a variety of disciplines, law, psychology, sociology, anthropology, international relations. To work closely with a group of mediators, we met for many months. I remember after our third meeting, and I said, okay, now we're ready to go and interview people. They didn't want to go. And I was thinking, all of you know that Beyond on Groups, you know the work of Beyond on Groups? The people take on the mothering role. I thought they wanted me to be their mother and tell them how to do it. But I said they actually had to go and do the work. And they did. They studied professional leaders like Howard Bellman in public policy and Patrick Davis in education. Those in the field like Larry Susskind and Alan Davis. And people who mediated in certain situations like Jimmy Carter and Ken David. We wanted to capture the particulars of their practice, their strategies for how they help parties come to an agreement, but to do so in a way that made their work accessible to a wide audience. We were guided by a New Yorker profile, magazine The New Yorker, about Theodore Keel. And Theodore Keel was a well-known labor mediator and arbitrator. We aimed for New Yorker-type profiles and even had New Yorker-style-type drawings in the book. This is a picture of Bill Hogwood. I just have to do my best so I can see. For my part, I trailed Bill Hogwood. He was a former federal mediator in his practice of grievance mediation. The first case that we did was a case called Rain Cloud over Rosie. Rosie was one of the few women in an Arkansas coal mine. The union had filed a grievance because the mining company had given a warning to Rosie that if she had one more accident, she would be fired. It was clear from Rosie's story as told in the mediation that as one of the few women in the mine, life in the mine was not easy. She did have a lot of accidents, hence the rain cloud. Over the course of that day and others I spent with Bill, I got to see how he used what he called conditioning. Conditioning meant letting the different parties know how they were likely to fare in arbitration, the more typical endpoint to a grievance process. One could see how his use of conditioning really did move the parties to a settlement. The company took back its warning and agreed to work with the union to make the miners a safer place for people like Rosie. I should also mention that in Districto, Arkansas, Bill Hopwood introduced me to Southern-style pulled pork sandwiches, which is one of my favorite things that I never had done before. A reviewer of When Talk Works noted that these profiles taken together give us the closest look we have yet had about the inside of the magic and hard work of the mediation process at a particular moment in time. Not sure how well it is today. As fruitful as PLM was for my career, it probably had the most influence on me because it inspired my work on gender. Immediately when I started at PLM, I became the instant expert on gender. People asked me to come and talk to their classes about gender differences. They seemed to assume because I'm a woman, I must know something about gender. I had never done any work. And obviously, as you know, only women have gender, so it wasn't for me. I was also having my own gender experiences in the program. Evaluations from our executive program singled out what they liked about the seminar. Roger Fisher and Tuesday morning. I was Tuesday morning. I decided learning more about how gender plays out in negotiation might be an interesting area for me to pursue. Indeed, Jeff in his book, The Social Psychology of Bargaining and Negotiation, claimed that the reason there were so many studies about gender because sex is one of the most convenient topics to measure. And that's what I did in the first paper. I wrote a paper called Her Place at the Table, based on the dominant literature of the time, such as Women's Ways of Knowing and A Different Voice. I did adopt what I would now call an essentialist view of gender, suggesting that a woman's voice and place in negotiation could be clearly distinguished from her male colleagues. This paper appeared in the last book that Jeff edited, Negotiation Theory and Practice, that was published the year after he died. I mention this because my work on gender involved in ways I wish you'd known about before I died. I began my empirical work on gender by studying my students' experiences through the final papers they wrote for my negotiation course. There were some that take a challenging situation, or more generally in their lives, and write about how they negotiate. Fiona was an evening MBA student who worked for a small business unit in a major technology company. Her boss gave her an almost impossible assignment. Sales is overselling, operations can't keep up, and there are delays that the customers complain. She's charged with getting sales to stop overselling. But it was clear to her that the guys in sales had no use for her, they wouldn't even need to talk to her. So she made her value to sales visible by making changes that had an impact on them. She cut the billing error rates so that her customers didn't complain as much, and she speeded up travel reimbursements from 30 days to 4. After that, they came to see her in a different light and were willing to negotiate with her to align their promises, the sales promises with operations capacity, and they did. She helped me see that women in business can meet resistance by using what I called strategic moves. One of my favorite stories, one that influenced my work on rules and terms that I'm going to mention, came from Andy, the owner of a struggling travel agency. She had just negotiated a good deal with a corporate travel executive. They shake hands, and while still holding on to her, as the executive says, I expect you to give me 3% of the commission. She tells him it's against the law. He stands up and yells at her and says, look, bitch, everybody does it. Annie first sits silent, and then she tells him to leave the office. He starts to laugh and says, babe, you were great. Annie was surprised. What I saw Annie do was respond to a move to put her down by turning it, interrupting the situation by telling him to leave. When I learned about the notion of moves and turns, I later wrote about it in a paper, Staying in the Game or Changing It, that appeared in the negotiation journal. The concept of moves and turns has been one that's been especially appealing to practitioners and students, judging by where it's been reproduced in teaching materials and field books for attorneys and negotiation instructors. Recently, a doctoral student from Australia interviewed me about it for the Gender Diversity Division of the Academy of Management called Tales of the Script. So let me say a word about stories and how I use them in my work. I see stories as critical to learning about practice. When I started my work on gender, it was a challenge to understand how gender could make a difference. Rejecting my initial essentialist view, which Linda critiqued, I wanted to look more deeply at how gender might matter in negotiation. Initially, that pushed me to look at what women in organizations were doing when they negotiated. What I learned there became a central premise of my work, that a focus on gender helps one see how parties are differentially positioned to negotiate. And the negotiation process is much about constructing a credible position for yourself and the other as it is about making a deal. Positioning is how negotiations empower themselves, construct interdependence, deal with offensive maneuvers, and foster participation among other issues. That's what came to be called The Shadow Negotiation, the book that HBO named as one of the best books of the year. The Shadow Negotiation is based on 300 interviews with a former student in my co-author, Judith Williams. We suggest that each time people bargain over issues, a promotion, a contract with a new client, a bigger role in decision making, a parallel negotiation unfolds beneath the surface of a formal discussion. Bargainers constantly maneuver to determine whose interests and needs will hold sway, whose opinions will matter, and how collaborative each person will be in reaching an agreement. The book describes strategic moves that negotiators use to position themselves. We call it advocacy, and then how they engage others through connection. To be an effective advocate means getting out of your own way, getting others to the table as Fiona did, and dealing with challenges like Annie did. Connection involves appreciating the legitimate concerns of the other party, giving them spaces to articulate them, and then working together to resolve the issues, what Fiona ultimately did with her sales team. We wrote an article for HBO called Breakthrough Bargaining. Linda mentioned it. I just want to say it came out in 2002, and it is in the 2019 book. Still, that's one of the best reasons. I think it's had a good history. But it had us move from simple advocacy and connection to articulating 3 different types of strategic moves. Power moves about getting into a position to negotiate. Process moves to get negotiation off the ground. And appreciative moves to help parties save face and keep the dialogue going. Encouraged by our editors and our HBR experiences, and then in book talks, men would come up to me and ask me to sign the book for their wives, and then say it's really for me. Then I decided we should interview some men, and that book came out as Everyday Negotiation, which just had more stories in it. Also at Simmons, I was leading and teaching negotiation and executive leadership programs for women in corporations and nonprofits, both national and international. I had some interesting feedback. In one program, I taught international agricultural scientists, primarily African women working for white European men. They told me that the negotiation program helped them realize they had choices in the world. In another program this week, including, one woman told me that I had changed her life. I got that, but I also realized that I need to explore further the ways negotiation has an impact on women and men in the workplace. At the same time as I was running these programs, I was also working on several organizational change projects. At Xerox, the Body Shop, Bernita Roddick had a big poster in the lobby that said, any mother with 2 children and 1 piece of candy can negotiate any contract in the world. And International Economics Organization, where we try to understand how gender plays out organizationally in terms of career paths, access to networks, to leadership opportunities, to performance evaluations, and challenges to integrating work and personal life. At the time, explanations for gender inequities focused primarily on what we called first-generation gender bias that took organizational practices for granted and compared men and women's behavior. Change would come primarily from fixing the limit. Among those fixes was negotiation training, which many of us had done. Our approach, second-generation gender bias, meant looking at the barriers to women's advancement that arise from policies and practices that appear natural and neutral, job descriptions, criteria for leadership, work and family policies, performance review criteria, but can have differential impacts on different groups of men and women. Kathleen McGinn from Harvard Business School and I applied these ideas to negotiation at first in the Kennedy School Conference and then in the International Journal of Conflict Management, with a paper titled From Gender and Negotiation to Gendered Negotiation. We introduced the notion of a gendered negotiating order, negotiating opportunities in the face of gendered jobs, negotiating authority in leadership roles, negotiating value for helping work, and negotiating support when not part of existing networks. This work had a big influence on my executive teaching, where the negotiation modules I taught focused on challenges women face in the workplace. I would start a program with something I called capital N negotiation, where I meant when you're an agent, and in negotiating behavior in an organization. And I would ask people, are you good at this? Yes, they could tell me anything. And then I said, little n negotiations, where you negotiate for yourself at work. What's different than not doing that? Lowercase n negotiations create a particular set of challenges, recognizing negotiating opportunities, getting negotiations off the ground, and dealing with resistance to change one is proposing. Teaching these programs and gathering the stories women told, as you can see, is the way I practice the theory, became the basis for my most recent book, with another former student of mine, Negotiating at Work, turn small wins into big gains. The idea is that small wins could lead to big gains. It's based on two ideas that I actually talked to some of you at lunch about. That when people negotiate about some aspect of work, it empowers others to feel legitimate asking. And in the process of negotiating both those issues, one becomes an informal advocate for change. This notion of negotiation took off. As evidence, Time Inc. named the book one of the best negotiation books of the year was published. I always like to say, I wonder how many negotiation books were published after that year. The next year, I was asked to do several White House programs for appointees who would be transitioning to the private sector from the Obama White House, and was asked by the U.S. ambassador in Bosnia to run a negotiation program for women politicians so they could enhance their roles in their political parties. It's also where I learned a great deal about resistance. My more recent work has taken a few new directions. Working with my daughter, we have taken some of the insights from negotiation at work and her work experiences in tech and created LinkedIn learning programs that surged in popularity during the pandemic. And the last year, I began working with a team about applying and revising these ideas for different groups of women. We have a recent HBO article called Negotiating as a Woman of Color, and our group hosted more work together. Well, I started this story about Jeff, and so let me end with one that has us both fighting and collaborating. Jeff and I did a lot of teaching together for several wonderful years. We ran workshops for business leaders in Paris, and that was wonderful. And we had this rule of how we talk together, independently. When he was teaching, I would sit on one side of the room and be silent, and he would do likewise when I was teaching. Well, one of our events was Girl Scouts USA. They asked us to run a negotiation workshop for executive directors and board chairs. As opposed to our experience in Paris, the audience had been limited, and so we decided I would add a gender piece. This is actually before I did most of my work in gender. We decided to use a program on negotiation video, HackerStar. I don't know if people still use that, but most of the video has Roger Fisher teaching the principles of getting to yes. The video ends with a meeting. Roger and his client and the other party, with his attorney, was a woman. And in the video, Roger keeps interrupting this woman. And I use this as an opportunity to have participants talk about how you handle situations not uncommon when being interrupted. As I'm running the discussion, Jeff moves to the side of the room into the center and starts raising his hand to explain to me that the purpose of the video is to showcase Roger Fisher. And he keeps talking, and I'm thinking, what is happening in the video is happening to me. So that's what I said. And Jeff seems pretty surprised and unhappy and moves back to his side of the room. After a brief separation in our respective corners and over a drink, we thought, this is the very work we claimed we wanted to do. In the negotiation issue, the first one was published after Jeff died. People added some thoughts about Jeff in an epilogue to their papers. And here's what I wrote. Several years ago, Jeff Rubin and I began a dialogue about relationships and negotiation. Dissatisfied with the concept of asymmetric prescriptive description, how great a notion, we began to think about the relationship as the locus of inquiry. It's rather like a play, Jeff said, where actors have roles that make them dependent on each other's performance. What advice we wanted would we give to the actors in a holistic entity? And so that's what we did. We rethought the ways we've been teaching and worked to find ways to integrate our work, to literally share the stage. And I still listen, and I still want to tell them how I moved beyond essentialism by work on gender. So thank you very much.